All right, welcome everybody. We are going to be starting some dissections, and this is the fun part because you guys get to start dealing with organisms as well. Hopefully your frogs are doing great and your fish are doing great. You're keeping them in the refrigerator, not the freezer. You are keeping them in their bags, wrapped up in their paper towels, and everything looks fantastic. Hopefully you have your dissection kit. I'm going to talk a little bit about those kits first, and then we're going to get into our dissection of our frog. All right. All of you should have in your kit a few different things. You might have a probe. It's probably going to look like this one. Or maybe it's as nice as this one in my right hand. But we should have something that we can point at things with, but not only point at things with, but probe at things with. That's the purpose of a probe, is to probe around. Maybe put the probe underneath a muscle like I've done before in some of these videos on Felis and Squalus. You should also have some forceps like these. They might be bigger. Maybe they look a little bit like these. Maybe they're even bigger and they look a little bit like these. But you should have some forceps. You should have a nice pair of scissors in there that are hopefully very sharp. Hopefully they're not too big. If you have two pairs of scissors, I would always use the smaller of the two. Notice my scissors have two pointy ends. Those pointy ends are very important when we're doing dissections. We might have another pair of scissors that have a more blunt end on one side. We don't really use those in comparative vertebrate anatomy. You might find those handy further down the road, but we're really going to be using these nice pointy scissors. Okay. Within your kits, you might also have a scalpel. You likely don't have the scalpel blade on it, but one of the things you're going to notice is we can take the scalpel and we can get rid of it. All right, we're not going to use it. Instead, we're going to be using primarily our scissors, our forceps, and our probe. And we only need one probe. We technically only need one pair of forceps, but if you have an extra pair, that's great. And you want to make sure you have your scissors. You may even have something like this, where it looks like your forceps, but it's got a locking mechanism down here. So I can lock it in place. These are hemostats, and these are extremely useful, but if you don't have them, it's okay. But if you do, I'll show you some uses that you can do with those. All right, so let's take a look at our frog. And we're first going to just look over some of the external anatomy. A few things I want to point out if we turn our frog over. We're looking at the ventral side. I'll take my probe and I'll use my probe to show you some of these things. If we looked at the forelimb, you're going to have broken up, just like we've had before, a brachium, an antebrachium, and our manus. That manus is going to include the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. Notice there's 4 phalanges here, and notice that they're very separate from one another. If I go to the hind limb, I have my thigh, my crus, and my pes. The pes has the tarsals. And remember, that was a tricky one in the skeletal anatomy because the tarsals on a frog, there's only 2 of them. There's one that looks like the fibula and one that looks like the tibula. And so many thought it was the fibula and tibula, but that fibula and tibula are actually fused as the fibiotibula. Up here is one bone within the crus. Down in the pes, you have those 2 tarsal bones. You have your metatarsals, and you have phalanges. Notice your phalanges are webbed in the back. On the hind limb, you have webbed phalanges, which gives this animal selective advantage when it's trying to swim through the water, just like somebody that's scuba diving would wear flippers. The frog will have a cloaca, which might be hard to see. It'll be located between the 2 limbs, right about here. And And we'll find out a little bit later when we're actually looking at the internal anatomy of the frog. And that's going to be much later. That's post-exam 2. We're not going there yet. If we look in the front of our frog, we'll see the mouth. We can put our probe in there gently, and we can gently pull the mouth back. In there, you'll see the tongue sitting on the floor of the oral cavity. That tongue actually connects in the front, the anterior portion of the oral cavity. And it's loose in the back end. That way, the frog can flip that tongue out when it goes to capture prey. If we look over at the dorsal side of our frog, we'll have 3 more structures that I want to show you. Let me see if I can't bring my light in a little bit more. So the mouth was in the front. You'll see the eyes behind them. And you may need to take your forceps and lift that upper eyelid to see the eye. The eyes might be sunken into the head. That gives the animal a selective advantage when it's underwater to protect its eyes. It could grab a hold of some prey, and while that prey might be struggling, the frog can sink its eyes into the head here to protect it from any harm. You may notice when you pull that eyelid up that there's a membrane over top of the eye. You can push that membrane off to the side to actually view the eye. The eye is going to look very cloudy. You're not going to see much. Between the eye and the mouth, you'll see a hole. Right there. Here's the eye. Here's the mouth. Here's that hole. That's the nares. Here's my other nares. Here's my other eye. The nares is similar to the nares that we saw on Squalus and Felis. The last thing I want to show you is if we go posterior to the eye, you have this structure that looks like an eardrum. That's the tympanic membrane. Tympanic membrane. So let's have a little bit of fun here. And let's look at what's deep to that tympanic membrane. I want you to take your scissors. Now, before you do anything, I want you to realize that when we do dissections, it's a lot of fun, but we always want to go slow, very slow. We want to be careful. If any of you are thinking about a future in medicine, this is one of the biggest skills that you will learn from doing these dissections, is the ability to have patience and go slow. A nice steady hand. So let's not rush this. We'll get all of this done during our lab here. I want you to take your scissors and notice that there's the pointy end. I'm going to take that pointy end and I'm going to puncture just barely puncture that tympanic membrane. And then I'm going to do a little snip. Then another little snip. I'm going to cut around the perimeter of that tympanic membrane. You can take your forceps and you can pull that out a little bit. I'm not yanking it off. I'm just lifting it up a bit. To make it easier to cut. So you might have your frog resting, whereas I'm trying to show you what I'm doing, so I have it lifted. I'm slowly going to cut around the perimeter of the tympanic membrane to remove it. Be very gentle when you do this. You might have some gunk in there you might need to clean out, but don't do that yet. So I was trying to cover up this side while I was showing you the frog because I've already done it on this side. So you can see both sides. I've opened the tympanic membrane. And what you'll notice in there is this white structure. That's the columella. Remember, we learned about the columella before. Here you can see the columella on my frog. Remember what the columella functionally is for. So we covered the nares, the eyes, the mouth, the tympanic membrane, the columella, the brachium, the antebrachium, the manus, the thigh, the crus, the pes. And we looked at the fact that the pes, the phalanges there, are webbed. We also identified the region in which we would see the cloaca. And we'll explore that a little bit more later when we deal with the urogenital aperture. We're not going to be dealing with that right now. Today we're only looking at muscles. We are not opening the body cavity of the frog. We are not opening the body cavity of the frog. You will have that at a later time. Please do not rush ahead. Okay? Our next video, we'll dive into some of the muscles.